It's a big pleasure and honor to be talking to you. I was supposed to go. I've never been in the Bay Area, and I was supposed to go to the Bay Area before the pandemic, appear. And probably this is why we are also doing this online instead of in person. So I will do my best to convey, through Zoom, my excitement of, in a way, being here today. And again, I'm very thankful to Booksmith as well as to UC Press, as always. Now it's my second book published with UC Press, and I'm eternally grateful with them. Now, perhaps I could start, and we were talking before. I will try to be as brief as I can, because to me the most interesting part is the one that in which we can exchange ideas and which is the Q&A part in these sort of presentations. But before all that, I thought that I could tell you a little bit about why and how I decided to write this book. And of course, the answer to that, there is a long answer and a short answer. The long answer is that I have been working on these things since, I started, I guess, working. So 2 decades ago, even before I entered the university, I started to work as a kind of, I would call it like a assistant to the research assistant in a research project on Nazism in my country, in Argentina. And from then on, I continue working on fascist sources, reading this stuff, and sometimes listening to this stuff, or listening from fascists even, trying to, and I think, by the way, that this applies to all my books. I wrote 7 of them, and all of them are, in a way, connected to a question which for me is very important. I hope you share my concern about this. Is why, the question is not why fascism is so bad, because at least in terms of my own politics and my knowledge of history, I know, that fascism is bad. The experience of fascism in history has been a disaster for the countries where this happened. And it led to catastrophe, death, violence, and so on. To me, that is not the question. That has an easy answer. Whether fascism is good or bad, is really bad. It's really bad for democracy. It's really bad for freedom. If you are not into violence, and if you are into peace, then you will also agree with me that is bad in that sense. It's bad because of its racism. It's bad because of its hatred of democracy, its hatred of freedom of speech, and so on and so forth. So the question of whether fascism is bad, I think is very easy to answer, not only in terms of one's own politics, but even historically. If you analyze what is the outcome of fascism, you see that historically the outcome has been very bad. So that's an easy answer. Whether fascism is bad, yes, it's really bad, or it was really bad, and continues to be bad. The question that I always wanted to somehow have an answer, and I wouldn't claim that I have the answer, but at least I have been trying to answer that question, is why people are into this. Why people believe that instead of being bad, this is actually really good. Why they believe that racist, authoritarian, and repressive leaders are good instead of bad. So why they believe in these horrible ideas, I will say. If you really push me, I will say that this is a question that I try to answer in all of my books. And all these books are connected because I have been asking this question laterally, analyzing different histories and different aspects of the history of fascism and then the history of populism. And then a couple of years, so first I wrote this book on how fascists communicated globally, which was a book about how fascism came to Latin America and which were the connections between, more specifically, Mussolini and Italy and the fascists in Argentina. Then I wanted to understand why fascism lasted that long. So I wrote another book in which I analyze the connections between fascism in the 20s and 30s and the Argentine Dirty War in the 70s. This was, a group of, it was a coup d'etat, and there was a military junta, and they decided that there were people that were enemies of the nation, and they also decided that these people were enemies of God, and enemies of the people, and then they kill them. They kill them in the name of the fatherland and the people, and they kill them, and this is the, what I suggest in that book, which was called The Ideological Origins of the Dirty War. They kill them because there was a fascist justification for killing these people, meaning that why behind the question of why people were killing my own country in Argentina was that these leaders were really into fascist ideology. Now, after that, I wrote a book which was finished, and this is important for the story that I'm telling and the topics that we are going to be discussing today. I decided to write a more general book on the connections between fascism and populism. And that book is this one, which was published in 2017 with UC Press. It's From Fascism to Populism in History. And this book had 3 chapters. One was called What is Fascism in History, in which I explain, according to my own interpretation, what is fascism. Then the second chapter was called What is Populism in History, and I explained the history of populism as well as basically what is populism. And in the third chapter, I tried to analyze the implications of populism. Now, the question, of course, is that after 1945, there were not fascist leaders in power. So the question is then why these populist leaders look or somehow connected to the history of fascism. So that was the question that I asked in that book. Then I have to say that that book was finished. I would say it was finished, the manuscript, or MS as we call it, was finished before November, before the November election that elected President Trump to power. The manuscript was finished, and I have to confess that in that manuscript, like everybody else, I mean, I analyze the past, I know the past as much as I can, but I certainly do not know about the future, and like many others, I thought that Donald Trump was going to lose. Now, as an historian of fascism and populism, in that book, I already concluded that what I saw in this populist campaign that Trump was running were a lot of fascist elements. But actually, I have to confess, I refer to Trump and his campaign in that manuscript, which was finished before the election. I actually added the following phrase. In his failed campaign to the presidency, Donald Trump showed a racism, for example, that was typical of fascism rather than the history of populism. And I remember Kate Marshall, who is my editor at UC Press, said, well, why don't we wait on the results of the elections before we send this book to press? So we waited, and eventually, you know, what happened, Trump won, and I had to, I would say, rewrite the book, because the entire thing changed, because it was now the first time in the history of populism that basically populism and I would say a very post-fascist and close to fascism populism that Trump represented came to power in the most powerful country in the world, and that never happened before. So basically, I tried to rethink, let's say, the success of these ideas, because now they were as successful as it gets. Now, even in that book, and then when I wrote a preface for the paperback edition, which was published last year in 2019, I tried to analyze the meaning of Trump and leaders like Trump. Because I will make it very simple, because I gave myself around 10 minutes just to talk, and then I really want to talk, to engage with your questions. So I will try to be brief. In that book, basically I analyzed the connections between fascism and populism. And fascism was many things. And it ended in 1945. And populists, many of them were fascists before 45, such as General Perón in Argentina, but also other leaders like Getúlio Vargas in Brazil and many others. They had been dictators or fascists that after 1945 changed their ways. And they changed their ways because they realized that fascism was toxic and you couldn't get into power from a fascist kind of platform or a fascist practice. Of course, some people disagree with them. They were called neo-fascists or neo-Nazis. They are still called that way, and they never reached power. So these early populists basically left, I will say, three elements of fascism behind. They carry on another elements. They were autocratic, they were authoritarian, but they left three elements. And I will say from Perón in 1945 to more recent populists, I will say until the beginning of the 21st century, populists will typically not engage in these elements. And these elements were violence. I mean, political violence and violence itself was, of course, as you know, a kernel of fascism. There is no fascism without violence. Fascism is extremely violent against its own citizens, and eventually goes to war and kills people all over the place. Now, these early populists left violence behind. Then a key element of fascism, of course, is dictatorship. Fascism is always a dictatorship, or always attempts or aims at dictatorship. And these populists did the opposite of what the fascists did. In the most famous cases of fascism, which are, of course, Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy, these fascists, they use democratic means to destroy democracy from within and create a dictatorship. Now, what the populists did, the opposite. Perón and Vargas were dictators that particularly Perón, destroyed dictatorship from within to create a democracy. So the guy was a strong man in a dictatorship, he called for elections, he won the elections, and then he was very authoritarian, but with votes. So this is the paradoxes of populism, that is authoritarian, but also is democratic. Now, this was then an element, a key element that populists left behind when they engaged with democracy. They left behind dictatorship. And populists typically do not destroy democracy. They really downgrade it, they even bastardize it, but they never or almost never destroy democracy. And the third element that I analyzed in that book, From Fascism to Populism, was xenophobia and racism. There is no fascism without racism. If we read the recent historiography of fascism, almost no historian claims that racism was not an issue in any single country. There was always racism and xenophobia in fascism. Of course, perhaps not to the radical extreme levels of Nazism, but racism is a key component of fascism. And these populists, what did they do? They left xenophobia and racism behind. They believed this was toxic for democratic politics, and you will not win elections by being a racist. That's what they thought. Of course, that doesn't mean that other populists tried it this way. In the US, for example, the racist Governor Wallace attempted to be the elected president of the US with a kind of with a clear message of racism, but he lost. So populists never reach power by engaging with dictatorship, political violence, or racism. So that's the story of populism. In the book, I concluded that what we were witnessing already in the early 21st century, and in a way, Trump not being unique at all, but rather perhaps one of the last examples of this, a very powerful and important example nonetheless, but just an example, not that unique as he claims as he claims his ideas are. But basically what we see is that you might remember that campaign, what the president of the US did. So he went in his palatial, building in New York City, and he started a kind of, very open racist statements against Mexicans, which he defined as rapist. And that was shocking because in populism, putting racism at the center of a populist message was not typical at all. And then something similar happened with Bolsonaro in Brazil. He was also elected by appealing to a kind of fascist playbook of racism rather than the typical populism. Then, of course, the same we can apply to violence. Either calls for violence, and as we saw more recently in places like Portland or New York City and many other places, clear uses of violence and repression, which are not that typical of populism, but more typical of dictatorships and fascism. So what we are seeing here, then I concluded, is a populism that, as opposed to previous populisms in the history of populism between 1945 and the early 21st century, we see a populism that is or was well, it still is, going back to key elements, or not of populism, but of fascism, particularly those elements that populists left behind, early populists left behind. And this applied to both right-wing and left-wing populists. Nobody, was doing this kind of racism or putting racism and violence at the center of the picture. And yet, we have a democracy still in America. They have a democracy still in Brazil. So we don't see this element number 3 of fascism, which is the destruction of democracy. So far, we don't see that. So that's why at this point, I would have some hesitation when we talk about Trump as a fascist. What we see here is fascist tactics mixed with populist tactics. Now, I always felt, and this is why, Evan, you said that my new book, A Brief History of Fascist Lies, is a complement to my previous books. I will do a display now, a kind of performative, these are the two. So it is a complement because in a way, there are many elements, and there was a fourth element which was equally important. So fascism was an extremely brutal dictatorship, a genocidal one. It put racism at the center of the picture. And it, of course, because of all these things are connected, it engaged in incredible amounts of violence. And this is the fourth element, it lied like no other politicians did before. It lied in a particular way, which in a way was not only a quantitative difference in the sense that fascists lie, much more than other politicians, but also there was a qualitative difference insofar as fascists believe their own lies. And this was, most politicians lie, I say this in the beginning of the book, but almost never they believe their own lies. And fascists do. And I will say then that populists, when they departed from fascism, when they, after 1945, they came to power, they would not lie. Their way of lying was more typical, of other ideologies, such as, I would say, communism or liberalism. All these politicians lie. But again, as I said, they don't believe their lies or they don't lie that much. Whereas we see in Bolsonaro, we see in Trump, and in these new populists, that not only they are returning to fascist ways in terms of violence and racism, but also they are returning to fascist ways in terms of their propaganda techniques and the way they lie. So this was the fourth element. Now, of course, of these four elements, we still lack, and happily we will continue to lack that element which is dictatorship, because we see in someone like Trump or someone like Bolsonaro in Brazil or Narendra Modi in India, and this type of populist politicians, we see that so far they have not been able to do what probably they would like to do, which is to create a dictatorship. That is the point, of course, in which we should be talking about fascism and not necessarily populism. But we are not there yet. And the last thing I want to say, and now it would be great if we could engage in this Q&A, is that is not only what they want to do, but really it's up to us, to all of us, to stop it. Because not only, they would like to, most of these leaders, they would like to be more dictatorial or even fascist dictators, but it's not that easy. And this only happened in history when people were apathic, when the free press was not defended and it was censored, and when lies basically replaced the truth altogether in those societies. And that's when fascism happens. So we are far from that. And yet we could be there if we don't defend ourselves and don't defend our democracy. So I will stop there and perhaps we can engage in some Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Federico. For those of you who are tuned in, if you have a question at any point, please feel free to ask in the chat. Since we don't have any questions yet, maybe I'll start us off. I want to just hear more about this question of whether Trump is a fascist in your estimation, and I guess why that matters so much. Like, why the importance of that distinction?
Yes, it matters a lot because, to me, Trump mixes, let's say, the populist and the fascist playbook. Probably, it's difficult to know what is in the mind of this guy. if anything, but it's clear that the way he speaks and the way he acts sometimes conflates what is typically populist with what is typically fascist. And I said that in terms of racism, for example, which is so key to him, so central to the way he's trying to be reelected. I mean, to play on race, on racial fears, to use racism as, again, as at the center of the politics. And the same with violence and repression. I mean, the way people were being repressed in places like Portland reminded me of the dirty war in my own country in the 1970s. This is what fascists do. This is not typical, or shouldn't be typical in a democracy. Now, the point is that again, there is a mix, because even the very fact that we are discussing these things online, or if without the pandemic we could have been discussing this in public, already show that we are not in a fascist situation yet. So he's not a fascist leader at this moment. But as I was saying before, so the question is Trump a fascist? No. Is he close? Yes, certainly. I mean, as an historian of fascism, as an historian of populism, I see that there are certain things that he does and certain practices he engages in, which are typically fascist rather than typically populist. And yet there are other practices which are typically populist. Now, if you tell me after November he loses and then he decides to ignore the results of the election and somehow he continues to be the president, I will call this a fascist dictatorship.
Right.
I hope I never have to do that. I mean, certainly.
Me too.
And in a dictatorship, perhaps I might not be able to do that. Who knows? But the point is that, again, it's not like, with fascists, it's not only, it's not only what they want to do. And as I said, like, I'm an historian. So from the history of fascism, you can take a lot of lessons, not only in terms of what is going to happen, but also in terms of what we should avoid. I mean, because when fascism won, there was a lot of apathy towards the defense of democracy. Then there were a lot of traitors, and by that I mean members of the judiciary, members of the armed forces, and members of, of the state apparatus that instead of identifying with the law and the constitution, identify with the whims of the fascist dictator. And that's how they won. That was a key reason of why and how they won. And of course, then, I mean, I think we need to continue reading the independent press and defend it, because they are the ones that gave us a lot of facts. And this is at the center of the book, that fascism thrives in lies. And when you study Trump, I think in order to understand why he lies so much and how he lies in terms of propaganda techniques, and I talk about this in the book, I try to explain it. Let's put it this way, I hope I explain it. It's that is certainly a fascist dimension of the entire thing. Now, of course, one thing doesn't make a fascist, is a combination of things. And so far, the dictatorial dimension is lacking. And so I will say that this is, in the history of populism, someone like Trump is as close as it gets, but and that should be scary enough. I mean, we don't need to call him a fascist in order to understand that he wants to be a fascist. And it's clear that he doesn't have a high regard for democracy. And even, like, I have a chapter in the book which is about democracy, and because this is a big fascist lie. I mean, because they say that fascism as a dictatorship is the most democratic regime that exists. And they talk about democracy. I mean, they lie, because basically what they understand as democracy for the rest of us is dictatorship. And what we have as democracy, they will call it a tyranny or a dictatorship. So my point is, like, this is typical of the fascist technique. And sadly, when you analyze Trump, you see similar techniques. Then of course, another question that one could ask, I will ask it and I will try to answer, is that whether Trump has studied these techniques. I mean, Trump has read Goebbels and studied the history of Nazism. And personally, I don't think so. I think he's a natural. I mean, he lies like a fascist without studying fascism. But again, like, we should remember that most fascists did not study fascism. They were just giving a kind of theoretical cover to their extremely violent, authoritarian, and lying behavior. So my point is like, this is why I have another chapter on psychology and psychoanalysis, because why they were so incensed with Freud and psychoanalysis? They hated it. And they hated it because they felt that what Freud was saying about the workings of the unconscious was exactly the opposite of what they believed was the truth. Because as opposed to facts and empirical corroboration, for example, they will talk about a truth that the truth is what you feel, what the leader feels is the truth. And it doesn't matter whether that can be corroborated or not. And then you can study this, as I did in the book, with the history of fascism, and you can see a lot of parallels in the present. So that's very worrying. So you have leaders in the present in many countries, including this one, that actually believe their own lies. Or even when they are, I mean, and Hitler and Mussolini typically did this, that even when they recognize that there is a lie in terms of what they are saying, they believe that that lie is little and is at the service of a larger truth. So Hitler famously said that, you know, the protocols of the elders of Zion were, I mean, this was a hoax, it was a horrible anti-Semitic racist lie. And they asked Hitler, I mean, and the protocols of the elders of Zion are like as fake as it could be. Apparently, I mean, the book, which sometimes is you can buy on the streets in many countries, talks about a meeting in the Jewish cemetery of Prague, in which different rabbis emerge out of their tombs. It's a kind of resurrection story, and they meet with communists and capitalists, all of them Jews, and they plot for the world domination. So it's like kind of a zombie world of anti-Semitism. And they asked Hitler whether he believed this. And Hitler said that even if there were some aspects that might not be true, the protocols talk about a larger or a deeper truth. Now, for the rest of us, that deeper truth is a lie, meaning that there is a particular group that wants world domination. And even like one of the paradoxical dimensions of it is the fascists that aim at world domination, not their victims. So there is another psychological element here, which is typical of their lies, that they somehow project, and I talk about this in the book, in terms of why and how they lie so much and how this operates. And one of them is the projection. The idea is that they ascribe to others their fears and their own self-identification. And we see a lot of that in fascism, as I show in the book, and we see a lot of that now.
Thank you, Federico. So I have some questions coming in. The first one is from Peter, and Peter wants to know why is there an inability on the part of certain individuals with historical examples held up to them to identify these fascist tendencies? Is it denial or being susceptible to cult mentality and or something else?
I think it's a really good question, and it already contains, I think, the answer, because this idea of, the leader operating as the owner of the truth, certainly is a cult mentality, and there is, most of us observe reality in terms of corroboration. We believe what we can prove. But this is replacing that notion of reality and politics with a more religious one, which is, of course, totally okay in the domain of religion and faith. But here what you have is the kind of displacement from the world of religion to the world of politics. And they behave like a religion in a way, perhaps with in this case, their leader, someone like Trump operating as a God-like figure or a Pope-like figure. And I analyze this in the book. And in fascism, this was typical. Hitler, for example, himself saying, like the Pope, I believe that I'm infallible and I'm always right. Mussolini also saying, I'm always right. And of course, now, more recently, Trump saying, I'm always right, or eventually, reality will prove eventually that I am right. Now, and here we arrive at another dangerous elements of these lying techniques and lying ways in which eventually they believe in their own lies. Because when fascists see somehow that their lies do not correspond to reality, what do? Well, if I believe it shouldn't be raining, but it's raining, then I look for an umbrella. Okay, so that's the very typical reaction. But basically, they will deny the rain, and somehow they will try for the rain to disappear. Of course, that's very difficult. But with racism, for them, it became, in a way, easier and extremely horrible. Because the idea was, for example, that typically the Nazis would say, Jews are dirty and they spread disease. Of course, that was a lie. Jews were not dirty, or they were or as dirty, as clean as everybody else, and certainly as a group did not spread, disease. Now, that was, I think anyone can arrive at that, at corroborating what I just said. But the Nazis, instead of doing that, they attempted, and they actually did, change reality in order to conform to their lies about the Jews. So what did they do? They put Jews in ghettos and concentration camps where sanitary conditions were horrible. And of course, Jews inside these ghettos and concentration camps were dirty. Eventually, they were not given food, and because they were put in such horrible conditions, they started to be ill, and eventually they spread disease. And a Nazi would say, you see, I was right, but they were not. They attempted to change the world and to make the world look like their lies. And the scary part is that sometimes they are successful. And sometimes, I think we can jump from here to recent repression in the US, for example, in Portland. In fact, that they lie about a conspiracy of people trying to occupy a city, and eventually they act upon the lie, going after people. And the same you could see with the way they treat the coronavirus. Someone like Bolsonaro in Brazil saying, this is a little flu. And people die out of they deny reality, they try to change it, they even suggest fantasy cures, and eventually people die. Eventually people see, in the history of fascism, we see that people realize that the emperor is naked, so to speak. But of course, a lot of people die because of that, before most people realize that. Mm-hmm. And I think, by the way, that we have a unique chance in this country in November, to deny this kind of alternative reality that they are proposing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And that makes me, brings me to another question. It makes me want to talk about the media and the media's responsibility. I have a good question from Alex, which is as follows. Even though Trump is not technically a fascist, Jennifer Rubin wrote a piece for the Washington Post over the weekend urging journalists to fact check the Trump administration on their lies. Of course, this has been an ongoing thing throughout his administration. The fact checkers, I can't keep up with the number. I know it's well over, 10,000, 30,000 documented lies. The first example came from CBS's Paula Reed, who challenged a lie President Trump has told about 150 times, namely that he signed the Veterans Choice Act. Another interview moment came on ABC's This Week when George Stephanopoulos confronted Trump's economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, who initially claimed that Trump's so-called executive actions extended the eviction moratorium. So Federico, what are your thoughts on the role of the media to confront lies publicly? Is this a responsibility? And how might fascist leaders respond, or how have they responded in the past? Does this change the perspective of the followers?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. And again, thank you for the question, and thank you for everything that that you have helped me with the book. And I think the role of the media is central here. And I think perhaps with some delay, they are doing what they should do as independent media, which is to question the lies emanating from, from power. I think there was a delay, and when the problem is, not the problem, but my own problem is that I have studied these things. And I wanted to be more hopeful after November 16, but I think the media lost a year at least waiting for a presidential change. And I was thinking, okay, I would like to believe what they would like to believe, but I know this history very well in order to be much more pessimistic about this. Presidential change, presidential tone. This is not who Donald Trump is as a leader. He thrives on lies, and he will lie his way. He's trying at least to continue this, this way of dealing with politics in order to be reelected. So it's important that his question, as perhaps more recently he has been questioned, but still I think there is, I would like, I say this as a reader, right? I think here that we really need to support the independent press because they have a huge role to play here, because this is the way most of us gather our facts, as opposed to the lies emanating from power, which are mere propaganda. At this point, it's very hard to trust a statement coming out of the White House. But on the other hand, we need to ask them, and we demand even, that they are really tough in asking the right questions. Because, for example, I saw this Axios reporter that he was praised for asking the tough questions, but this should have been happening, or it should be happening all the time. Mm-hmm. And this, I think, this is a problem, particularly in the US, where sometimes there is a misidentification of being neutral with presenting two sides. And this is as a question regarding fascism and populism as it can be, in the sense that there are no two sides to racism. There are the racists and there are the anti-racists. There is no middle ground here. So to think that there can be a middle ground between, let's say, Trump's lies on disease and the scientific version or the scientific take on disease, it's a huge mistake. So my point is that this is an issue, and it's a challenge for the traditional way in which media reported, because the idea is that there are two sides, the so to speak, of which, two-sidism, that there are two sides, and there is somehow there is a kind of middle point where truth emerges, or truth emerges out of a middle point. But this is not the case, because when you have these propaganda techniques and these lies, there is no truth that can emerge out of these lies, because they are propaganda lies. They are not a take on reality. So, it's a challenge. And I think, some different outlets are dealing with this and being more successful than others, and readers are demanding a lot, and rightly so. And I think this is a really important problem, I think, in the ways things are analyzed. That as historians, we know this because we read newspapers from many decades ago, and we sometimes see the same problem, that they are reporting on the Holocaust, and apparently there were two versions, or this was not as important news as it should be. And so my point is, then we should learn from these histories in order, and the press as well.
Yeah, it strikes me though as irresponsible. I'm wondering if you agree, for journalists to cover what the things Trump says as though he might be telling the truth. Is it irresponsible to treat somebody who lies like a fascist as though they might be telling the truth?
I think it is naive.
Yeah.
It is naive because, given the history of this before Trump, and now we have a history of Trump in power, to talk about a presidential tone or other sort of incantations, this is not what's going on.
Right.
But I think it's, I think this is getting better. And you might remember, for example, that it was very difficult to talk and even to write about racism, in the Trump campaign, which now nobody denies. But basically, you might recall that they were talking about, with a kind of words that somehow try to encapsulate that without encapsulating it. Mm-hmm. This is not nativist, this is racist. And so on and so forth. So now I think you see more of that. But then you see a lot of euphemism as well, like creating racial tension. No, it's racist politics.
Right.
And again, this is I think we can learn again here from the history of fascism a lot, because another element here, for example, is that, and I refer to this regarding racism and anti-racism. Historians of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, when we study Nazi Germany, we don't see the two sides. Because we talk, because this is the question: are his voters racist, or they just ignore racism and vote for other things? And that happened in Germany as well. I mean, were all voters for Hitler anti-Semitic as Hitler, or they just voted for the economy or other concerns instead of caring too much about Hitler's racism and anti-Semitism? And of course, most people that voted for Hitler were not as racist as Hitler. That's why we call them moderate anti-Semites, as opposed to extreme anti-Semite that Hitler was. But if somebody is voting for a racist candidate, that somebody is not in a middle ground. That somebody ignores racism, and somehow that somebody then is within the racist spectrum. A moderate, a person that doesn't care much about racism is not having a neutral position. It's a person that somehow is justifying racism, thereby entering the racist spectrum. And this is tough because when I imagine, like I don't have to, but if you have to report on Trump voters, this is a really tough question. But how do you call a person that doesn't care much about racism? And I can tell you how we do that in the history of Nazi Germany. We call them moderate anti-Semites. They were willing to put up with Hitler's own extreme anti-Semitism. I mean, and Trump, as you know, has been able to play that very well. Another way of answering this is that this is not only about Trump, is that, he's obviously harvesting a lot of things that, were planted before.
Absolutely. And I think the media has had to learn throughout this administration how to deal with that.
As all of us. I mean, as I was saying in my introduction, I had to learn a lot because I thought populism operated in a certain way, and I see now that this is changing, that they are going back to the ways of fascism.
Thank you. So I have a question here from Bruce that I think speaks to that a bit. And Bruce is wondering, isn't it true that many fascists have taken power fairly slowly over years, patiently working for absolute power rather than a kind of a more spontaneous rise to power as we've seen here in the United States?
Yes, and I mean, and the fact that, and this is again, like I'm an historian, so, but I have to, in a way, how can I say, warn myself not to, to be absolutist about this, because the fact that it happened in a certain way doesn't mean that it could happen in a very different way. So my point is, even when they took power, fascism typically took power at least in three ways: destroying democracy from within. As you know, in the Italian case, it took more time. In the German case, it happened quicker. Then in other cases, it happened by coup d'etat, and civil war, such as in Spain. And then in other cases, it happened because your fascist buddies invaded the country, your country. And then, you have fascism in France or in Hungary because the Nazis invaded. So fascism can happen in many ways. And perhaps it could happen in ways that we haven't seen before. What I want to say is that, yes, it could happen slowly or quicker. And we should be, in either case, we should be, how can I say, worried. Because what we are seeing is that authoritarianism is increasing. And again, I mean, there is a big debate about fascism or not. I'm an historian of fascism, so I mean, I don't work on the Inquisition. If I work on the Inquisition, perhaps I could add from the perspective of the Inquisition. But I work on fascism and populism, so what I can add in terms of my own research and knowledge is from these kind of experiences, which sadly are very much connected, I think, to the present.
Thank you, Federico. And this is just a last call for questions. If you have anything else you'd like to ask Federico, now is your chance. While we wait, I just want to remind everybody that A Brief History of Fascist Lies is available from Booksmith. Thank you, Federico. As are all of Federico's books. You can order at booksmith.com. I will drop in the direct link for the book here in just a moment. I also just a reminder that this is part 2 of a 6-event series that we're doing with UC Press. next week, we'll be joined here by Aya Gruber for her book, The Feminist War on Crime, The Unexpected Role of Women's Liberation in Mass Incarceration. So I hope that you can join us next week as well. Just any last questions for Federico? Meanwhile, Federico, is there anything that you'd like else that you'd like to leave us with?
Well, I would like to read from one of the quotes that starts, that is at the start of the book. And I have 3 quotes, which I think tell a lot about what we are talking about here. And let's say they are from 3 world leaders. One of them is Benito Mussolini, the other is Hitler, and finally the other one is Donald Trump. And I would like to start with Trump. He said in 2018, what you are seeing and what you are reading is not what's happening. So this is at the center of what I argue in the book. Because you ask, okay, how could it be that what I'm seeing is not what's happening? So, I mean, and you see that here there is a different thought process and a different ideology regarding what is truth and what is not. And generally, my point is that what generally people like Trump believe is the truth is what people like are into evidence and corroboration believe it's a lie, and vice versa. What people like Trump believe is fake, for example, fake news, most of us regard as just news or facts. So perhaps I could end with that.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Federico. This has been really enlightening. Thank you for joining us. Congratulations on the book. And to those of you who are here with us, I just want to thank you again for being here. Thanks to UC Press for working with us on this series. I will drop the link for the book here in the chat again now. If you order from Booksmith, we'll send it right to your door, and we're offering free shipping throughout San Francisco and the East Bay. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.